going on here. So I appreciate that, Robert. That's very good. And I have to ask you a question. Because when we were at the luncheon together, we had some interesting conversations going around the table. And you had indicated that the type of physics you worked in were a bit different from what I would call the theoretical physics, although you knew
Definitely,
something about
I'm a
string theory.
plumber. I build things that work at super cold temperatures.
I was going to ask you if you had some comments about the Higgs boson discovery,
Well,
but it has to be brief because
I'm surprised it took them so long to find it. But you actually needed the collisional energies that you could get at CERN in order to get in the energy range where the Higgs was finally found.
Yeah.
Had it not been found, we would all evaporate because we have no mass.
All right, are the people who are Zooming capable of hearing me?
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, great. Now, just remember that what we'll do is ask you to mute your own microphones, and you can use the chat function, I think, to ask a question. And Tom can decide if he's going to interrupt my lecture in order to answer the question, and I have no problem doing that. But similarly, if we can keep going, there'll be periods where certainly I can stop and just say, does anyone have a question? And let them begin to ask their question audibly by either holding down your space bar or unmuting, if you know how to do all that. All right? Okay, Tom, let's start recording. Okay, already done?
Yeah, it's all ready.
Okay. Bob Pompeo asked an excellent question, and that is that given the events that happened on December 7th, and I'm going to get into those in just a moment, in 1941, what was the status of Japan vis-a-vis the Soviet Union? And if we go back to some of the lectures that I had delivered earlier on the Russo-Japanese conflict in 1939, how the Japanese confronted and attempted to hold on to some territory that the Russians thought was properly theirs, an ongoing conflict everywhere, that the Japanese took a bit of a bloody nose. And at that particular point, the question arose, particularly in the Japanese army, should we try to press north, or should we hold what we have in the north and press south? That is to try to do more to damage and conquer or force China to accede to our demands. And similarly, at the Japanese very high levels, there was great concern, as I mentioned prior to ending the last lecture, that Japan had found herself increasingly in a situation where she had enormous commitments in the war in China, but similarly lacked resources which she would need to continue the fighting. That particular resources of coal, steel, iron had been embargoed by the United States, but she was gaining some control in Manchuria and other places in China where she could begin to gather some of those resources. But what she utterly lacked was any access to oil and rubber. And she needed these if she was to survive as a modern economy. Now, just in terms of going back for a moment historically, we have to remember that prior to Japan literally being forced open to the West, and the Americans had a great deal to do with that, she had been almost a feudal society in comparison to the technology of the West, really deficient. And it was that technological superiority that ended up forcing Japan to begin to change from what it had been. that she did so in such an incredibly short period of time, where she found herself able to utterly defeat the Russians in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-05, sinking nearly all of the Russian fleet, both that was stationed in the Far East and that had come from the Baltic, but also defeating the Russian army and taking Port Arthur and the rest of Korea and a good chunk of what was still allegedly part of China under her own control. She found herself in a position of technological ascendancy, and her economy began to blossom as a result. But her fundamental requirements of fuel still remained outside her own boundaries. So as things progressed over the next number of decades, even though she allied herself with the Allies in World War I, she really engaged in very little activity. She was able to take over a bunch of islands in the Pacific that had been previously owned by the Germans. So from her own standpoint, and again, this is what is critical to understanding why nations even go to war, is to understand that initially, although militarism and nationalism were extraordinarily powerful in Japan, the other issue is that in order to preserve a modern economy, Japan had to have access to resources. Now, with open trade, you could argue that that's perfectly okay. You can get trading anywhere around the globe, and you can bring in what you need by import, and you export what you can in order to pay for all of that. But as her activities in China escalated and her involvement there became increasingly deep and expensive, not just in terms of material and the economy itself, but in terms of manpower, people dying, and the commitments of having hundreds of thousands of soldiers engaged in combat in China, you now had a situation where the West and the United States in particular were beginning to say enough is enough, and we want to bring this fighting to a halt. What you're doing now has crossed a line for us where we can no longer sit back passively and accept it. Now, from Japan's standpoint, in the lead up to her main engagements in China, particularly beginning in 1937, there had been international messages, if you will, which had existed in the forefront. In particular, the experience of Italy, which I addressed in previous lectures, of attacking Ethiopia and taking over Libya and finding very little of consequence done by the the League of Nations as a result, basically said to Japan, you have carte blanche. The League of Nations isn't going to stop you. And any sanctions they levy are really going to be relatively trivial. Remember, Italy also had no access to fuel in her own national boundaries. And indeed, even by taking Libya, which had some oil, but not a great deal as known at the time, and certainly Ethiopia was nothing more than a sinkhole for the Italian economy, as it turned out. Basically, Japan looked at what the League of Nations had done and said, we don't have anything to worry about. They can complain all they want. At the same time, Japan began to press, particularly the United States and Britain, to change some agreements which had been reached in the 20s and 30s over the amount of tonnage each nation would hold in relationship to each other. You may have heard of the 5-5-3 ratio that was set up between Britain, the United States, and Japan in the first London conference. As a result of that, the Japanese said, well, we're not inferior. So even though Britain and the United States were known to have global responsibilities, multi-ocean responsibilities, which Japan did not have, the Japanese still felt very offended by that. They also were offended historically by the resolution of the Russo-Japanese War, 1904-05, when the United States intervened and actually forced Japan to give up certain gains that she had made. She felt she'd been mistreated in that regard. So from her standpoint, she had the following issues. In addition to immigration laws, which also began to limit how many Japanese could come to the United States, which she saw as a racial profiling, if we want to use modern terms for that, she had seen herself grow enormously, not necessarily willingly initially, into a modern economy, which required resources for its survival and function. She had seen weakness in the League of Nations, especially regarding Italy, and saw no reason why she shouldn't be treated the same way. Finally, as she began to have these deepening commitments in China, coupled with what I talked about last time about the Hekko, Ichiu, and Bushido, and these other philosophic trends that were existing and important in Japan, she was beginning to see that she was more and more dependent on the West, and therefore, particularly the United States, might be able to force Japan to make decisions which she felt were not in her best national interests. Now, once we got to the point of cutting off oil, that basically said to Japan, your economy is going to die unless you agree to our demands. And we had specific demands, and those demands were not necessarily all that pleasant as far as the Japanese were concerned. So they were forced by their own actions, and I'm not excusing them, but also by the actions of the international community in a lot of different ways, to be forced into a situation where they had to abandon China or fight. And this is a critical element to keep in mind about how actions of any particular nation can force itself into a series of decisions, both by itself and by others, which end up challenging the world order and leading to real conflict. Now, I'm not going to draw too many comparisons to what's going on currently in Ukraine and Russia, but I think the message is pretty clear. As we look back on the history of the United Nations, as we look on the creation of NATO, as we look on the decisions and economy that Putin has faced in Soviet Russia prior to the collapse, and then the Russian Federation after the collapse have faced, we can begin to see certain dynamics come together that make what we're talking about now in the Pacific Theater resonate with us. We can look more deeply into some of these matters and begin to think a little more carefully about the actions we are currently taking and the kind of goals that we're promoting in our own political discourse. Just as recently as yesterday, there's still some people who were talking about Ukraine winning the conflict with Russia, but without defining what that really means or putting it within a realistic context, or telling the rest of us just how deeply committed we as a nation are going to be to that particular goal. When also, I think everyone is very aware of, we've had, depending on how dramatically you want to phrase it, our sovereignty violated by a Chinese balloon passing over the continental United States, gathering information and intelligence of who knows what nature, but not done accidentally. So these kinds of challenges all reflect the same kind of issues that existed in the Pacific Theater that we're going to come to now. Now, there's another element to this that is important, and I showed this slide before, And that is, on the part of the West, there was a deep lack of appreciation for the technological advances that Japan had been making. She had shown herself enormously creative and adaptive. Yet, in spite of that, in spite of her beating the Russian Navy in 1904 and 5 and so on, despite the defeat she faced in 1939, when she took the Russians on in a land campaign, she had created certain technological advancements which surprised the West, and in particular the United States. So one of the dangers is pointed out in this slide is that you think all he's going to do is bite you, and instead he comes out with a flamethrower. And that's about what happened to us. And we need to keep this in mind when we begin to understand more deeply what actually was happening in the Far East and how this ended up resulting in Pearl Harbor and the following effects that we're going to discuss here. All right. I showed this slide because I want to emphasize how much territory Japan controlled. And as I was driving over here today, an interesting comparison came to mind, and I want us just to reflect on it for a moment. 1944, the British, Canadians, some French, and the Americans crossed the English Channel and land on the beaches of Normandy. There are about 3 million soldiers in England, but the landing itself involves a couple 100,000 at most within the first couple of days. And the number of ships involved is enormous. That's estimates up or around 5,000 vessels of one sort or another. Huge undertaking. Took the United States and Britain a couple of years, not just to plan it, but to gather the resources together to do it. What about this? Here's Japan, much smaller in terms of population, a large portion of its forces already committed to China, and yet the operations they carry out within just a couple of months over literally thousands of miles is an extraordinary achievement. It reflects a level of genius that most of us fail to appreciate. Now, part of the reason for their success, admittedly, was that the opponents in those areas were to a fair degree inadequate to the situation. And that was partly a good failure of doctrine and training that existed among Britain, the Dutch, and the Americans in these particular regions. But it also reflects not just our own failures, but the enormous intelligence and capacity with which the Japanese conducted their operations, often going up against superior numbers. And this in itself is something that they did almost 3 years before we crossed over into Normandy. Now, we did invade towards Northern Africa over a long period of distance in late 42. But again, what I want to bring out in this is that the understanding of what the Japanese could do and how they did it is something that is an extraordinary achievement. So it wasn't just that they had certain elements of superior technology, a better torpedo, for example, called the Long Lance, an early war, more maneuverable, longer range fighter, the so-called infamous Zero. But they had better dive bombers with longer range. They had better torpedo bombers with longer range. They built the largest battleships the world has ever seen. The Yamato and the Musashi, 70,000 tons. So their capacity was extraordinary. And the way in which they integrated things is just, again, worth a great deal of study and interest. Now, this just shows the extent to which the Japanese were able to move in just a period of about 6 months. An extraordinary achievement. And what they did in the process deserves a great deal of study. Now, I also want to bring this out because after the Japanese abrogated all of the naval agreements, they went on to a building spree, if you will, much like Germany did to challenge Britain prior to World War I. But the important element here was to show that Japan, particularly as you'll see on part of the slide, the NAC is naval aircraft, okay? And you'll see for carriers, these are fleet carriers, these are light carriers, these are seaplane tenders that allow for a ship to be anchored in an island where there's no air base and support long-range patrol craft from being out and finding out where your opponents are. The number of battleships, heavy cruisers, light cruisers, destroyers, and submarines. So what you begin to see here is the dominance in terms of quantity as well that the Japanese were able to put together. I showed this slide before as well to give you an idea of the scope of operations. And this is just the Dutch East Indies, or as we know it, Indonesia. This is Borneo, this is Celebes, Sumatra, Java, and so on. So we have these particular places, all of which were within the Japanese planning, but covered enormous distances. And there's nothing simple about sending transports from different bases, because they had to come from different bases, scattered along Japan and along the Chinese coast and some of the islands around like Taiwan, Hainan, and others. Taiwan was called Formosa back then. And coordinate all of this activity so ships would arrive at the right locations at the right times with the proper support to make sure their amphibious landings could be conducted properly. Now, what about Pearl Harbor? Again, just another example of the distance in which the Japanese fleet traveled in order to attack the United States. And this is important for a couple of reasons. One of them is, of course, that what it did was push the United States into the war immediately, but with the moral focus that we had been blindsided before an absolute or proper declaration of war. When you go through the histories of it, and Greg brought some things here which are worth you're looking at. At Dawn We Slept is particularly a very good book on the subject. I don't know about Prelude to Pearl Harbor. That's not what I've read.
It's a picture book.
Oh, okay. Good to have pictures. The idea here is that the Japanese planning for this, despite the emphasis that you will come across in many histories or in the movies, and some of which are excellent, and I talked about them last time, that the Japanese were really stuck with a major strategic problem. They knew they weren't going to invade the United States. All right, just as Hitler knew he wasn't going to invade the United States. Right, that just wasn't in the playbook for either of them ever. So you had to set up a particular strategy, which, since you were going to go to war in order to preserve your economy and your sovereignty, had to be done in such a way that you had some chance of reaching a political success at some point. Both the Japanese Army and the Japanese Navy knew that the American economy was far greater in capacity than theirs. So if there was a prolonged war, pretty much everybody knew Japan would lose. So the ultimate question is, how do you avoid a prolonged war? There are a couple of interesting arguments that I will bring forth here to raise the question whether Yamamoto actually made one of the most critical strategic errors for the Japanese goals that could have been made. By striking the United States Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor in basically a surprise attack, regardless of the failure of the Japanese ambassador to translate the 14th part, which was to be delivered to Cordell Hull and basically said negotiations are broken off. That's not a declaration of war. That just means we're breaking off diplomatic relations. It'll lead to war if we don't resume them. But even if that document had been delivered on time, what happened at Pearl Harbor was a surprise attack. Let me put it in this context. Suppose a half hour or an hour before two airplanes struck the Twin Towers, another plane struck the Pentagon, and another plane went down in a field in Pennsylvania. Suppose we had been told that this was going to happen. Would you react differently and say, oh, well, that's all good? You know, no. The point is that you would react very similarly. So what Yamamoto did, which in one way was a gross strategic error, which he indeed recognized in his own comment, but he failed to see it in context of his own decision, was we have awakened a sleeping giant and filled it with a terrible resolve. Think of it in this way. Other Japanese planners wanted to establish a defensive perimeter powerful enough that when the American fleet approached that perimeter, it would be weakened by land-based air power and then crippled or destroyed by the remaining Japanese Navy. The American fleet is moving from Pearl Harbor with its carriers and associated surface fleet and so on, and they're approaching Guam or whatever and come under repeated attack, and you lose most all of it. Does that fill you with the same resolve as the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor? It's a different mindset. That doesn't mean you won't continue to fight. It just means that at the same time, you don't have the same attitude towards your opponent that you have when he strikes Pearl Harbor. So emotionally for the American people, this becomes in one way a big strategic error. It's a little bit like when the Confederates fire on Fort Sumter, rather than allow Fort Sumter to be evacuated and whatever. Once you fire that first shot, you've galvanized your opponent. That's a different ballgame. Now, again, I want to keep this in mind because what happened at Pearl Harbor, of course, is well known to most all of us. And I just have a few pictures and slides to show about Pearl Harbor, how it was organized, the Japanese plans of attack. And this was an extraordinary achievement. Again, the planning that went into this attack was amazing. When you start getting into the details of you're launching aircraft, first, which ones go first? Secondly, how do you hold them up in a pattern until everybody is organized and ready to go? That means you have to calculate time and distance very, very carefully. What kind of weapons are they going to carry? Who goes in first? Who goes in second? What are your main targets? How do you take those out? All of which has to be coordinated and was exceptionally well coordinated when you consider how rapidly the Japanese attacked, sunk so many of the American ships, destroyed basically the American Air Force that was based on the islands, and returned to their carriers intact with a loss of only 29 aircraft. Extraordinary undertaking. So this is what goes on in these kinds of situations. And again, we didn't realize that Rambo was out there, or Rambo Dog was out there. We just didn't appreciate it. All right, so here we see the Arizona going down.
At what point did we break the Japanese code?
We knew their diplomatic code quite a bit before. That's why we actually translated those 14 parts before the Japanese ambassador did. The naval code, we had been breaking portions, but it was still somewhat episodic. But we put in an enormous effort. A fellow named Rochefort, whose name you may know, who put together this amazing intelligence network. And they really began to decipher certain things. But it wasn't until a little bit later in the war that we were gleaning enough information, such as happened before Midway, that we could begin to more critically identify those important elements in what the Japanese High Command was telling their Navy forces, for example. It allowed us to do a number of different things, much as the knowledge we had about the German codes. and
So
things
we
of that
broke
sort.
it before Midway, but after Pearl Harbor,
We had broken parts of it even before.
but not enough to know that they're coming. But
Right, and that's
Midway,
because-
we knew where they were.
Right.
Okay.
The reason we didn't know what was happening as well with them coming to Pearl Harbor was that once they left the Kuriles Islands, they basically maintained radio silence. The only time radio silence was to be broken was if a diplomatic solution was reached, and then the codes were very brief. So the one that told the Japanese fleet that was coming to Pearl Harbor that the attack was to go forward was climb Mount Niitaki. And then the only other radio communication was when the aircraft came over Hawaii, that they had the code word Tora, 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 which meant tiger, tiger, tiger. We've surprised them where they are. But other than that, there were to be no other communications. So that fleet sailed silently across the North Pacific, well out of range of anybody finding them. These particular spectacular photographs show you the power of weapons even back then, particularly if you happen to hit a magazine and take everything else with it. And the surprising thing is that for all of the ships that were sunk at Pearl Harbor, nearly all of them got back into the war. Arizona did not, but pretty much everybody else did. Now, the other interesting side element that we forget and is important as part of this analysis is the following. The battleships that were sunk at Pearl Harbor were relatively antiquated. So what we were losing was, in effect, other than the personnel involved in the training and all the experience that ties into that, but in terms of just equipment, we were losing old equipment. The Japanese had been modernizing their fleet, particularly from the late 20s, but more particularly in the 30s. We didn't start that until the mid-30s, when different acts were passed by Congress under the president's initiative to rebuild the American fleet. But our particular plans were for a 5 to 10 year future, so that by the time the war broke out, we were still behind the curve, not just in terms of building, but in terms of modernization. Because under the agreements, that 553, for example, which actually wasn't just a ratio that was arbitrary, it was set on particular tonnages that were to be permitted. We ended up scrapping a number of ships that were already being built, or converting them. So the Lexington and the Saratoga were not initially designed as aircraft carriers. They were converted from ships that otherwise were going to be scrapped. So it's just an example of how the things evolved over time. Now, again, yes.
How much influence did the British decisive action against the Italian fleet at Taranto have in terms of the Japanese thinking and a similar attack at Pearl Harbor?
I don't have definitive information on that, but I will say that the both sides were aware of it, but the Americans, for some reason, the dereliction in command was pretty profound when you really come to it, but I'll try to address it in the following way. The Japanese were aware of it. Whether they modeled what they were going to do on Pearl Harbor was based on the Toronto attack by the British Swordfish and so on. In terms of their development, that is the Japanese development, they may have seen this as another way of claiming that they could attack Pearl Harbor. They just had to make the proper technological changes to their torpedoes. Normally, a torpedo would sink as much as 75 to 100 feet when it was dropped from a plane at 200 feet altitude. And that's where torpedo planes tended to come in. And it would go down 75 feet before it would come up, and then it would hit its running towards its target. So you had to drop it far enough away from your target in order to let it plunge, come back up, achieve its particular depth, and then arm and strike the target as it went. Toronto's harbor was not that deep. So the Japanese, look at this, I wonder how the British managed to do that. That's a little unusual. So when they did their own investigations, they found that by modifying the fins on the torpedoes, that they could go down much less than that, because Pearl Harbor, from where they were planning to attack those battleships, was only about 40 feet deep. So you just couldn't have them plunge down into the sea bottom. It's no good for you there. Similarly, in their dive bombing attacks, they recognized and knew from other experiences that hitting targets from on top, where the armor was less powerful, less resistant, was something very, very useful. And the way that they knew the American battleships were lined up side by side, as well as in a line, obviously those ships on the inside would not be hit by torpedoes. All the torpedoes would hit the outer ships. So they had to plan how these attacks would go forward in such a way. This is how the details really come in. That if you're hitting the outside ships and you're beginning to cause them to capsize because you put all the holes on their starboard side, for example, or port side, depending on which way they're facing, then you still need the dive bombers or other high altitude bombers to do the rest of the damage that's going to take them out. So that's just an example. Now, to answer another part of this, though, when Yamamoto is looking at putting this attack forward, I have not seen a single piece of evidence that said Yamamoto wanted the oil facility struck, nor the submarine bases struck. Now, when you're training and arming your attack force, you have to provide them with the practice to go after those kinds of targets. The emphasis, it appears to me from all that I've read, is that the emphasis was on destroying the Pacific Fleet, and in particular, the battleships and the carriers, if they could catch them in port. The carriers were not there. All right, the two carriers that were there were out at sea. Fortunately, a day or so away and further south, so they weren't picked up by the Japanese. Had they been picked up by the Japanese, they almost certainly would have been sunk, because you had 6 aircraft carriers against 2. And there's just no way that imbalance, especially with longer range that you have from the Japanese, is going to work in your favor unless you are really lucky, a la Midway. And we'll come to that at another time. The reason for this heavy emphasis on what's going on is because it conditions pretty much everything that's going to happen down the road. So sinking American battleships, when surface engagements was still considered to be the big naval battle, a la Jutland from 1916, that approach to battle was largely gone. And there were few, though some significant surface engagements that took place that involved heavy battleships. But they were relatively small in comparison and had less influence on the outcome of the war than did carrier-based fighting. So it's interesting that Yamamoto did not train pilots to destroy the infrastructures of Pearl Harbor. They had no plans to invade Pearl Harbor. There were no transports or anything being sent in order to occupy the islands afterward. And the target was the heavy ships, which actually would play little role overall in how this war is fought. So there's some strategic misconceptions. If the carriers matter, you would want your intelligence people in Pearl Harbor who were providing the information to Japan to say, the carriers left on Tuesday. We don't know when they're back. We don't know where they're going. Well, then you might say, those are the ones we really need to get. How are we going to find them? We're not at war. There may be radio communications linking us to where they are. And instead of going for Pearl, let's go get those guys. Because remember what the perimeter was based on. The perimeter was based on land-based air power to destroy the oncoming fleet as much as possible, weaken it. And then you have your carrier-based and your surface fleet capable of annihilating the remnants. So there's a strategic disconnect that begins to develop. And in spite of the brilliance with which this was carried out, you have a different situation arising when you begin to look at it strategically. Now, shortly after Pearl Harbor, the British made, again, one of those famous errors in thinking that powerful surface ships somehow can survive against land-based air. And the Repulse and the Prince of Wales were sent up to Kuala Lumpur to try to destroy the transports which were landing on the Malay Peninsula. And they were caught at sea without any air cover and sunk with a very heavy loss of life. This brings us back to another strategic failure that occurred among the Allies, not just been beating on Japan, but against the Allies. In conversations prior to the breakout of the Pacific War, the British and Americans had been discussing, and with some cooperation with the Dutch, how things would play out in the Pacific if and when war came. So they were thinking very hard about this, and they developed a number of high-level decisions in order to try to facilitate what those actions ultimately would be. One of the key elements was Britain felt strongly that Singapore needed to be held as sort of the key to the Malay Peninsula and to the Indian Ocean. However, Britain herself had insufficient force in terms of the Navy to be able to make Singapore worth holding. And the Americans challenged the British on that point on a number of occasions and basically ended up making an agreement with Britain that Britain would be solely responsible for Singapore and the Indian Ocean. The United States would be responsible for the mid-ocean area and supplies to New Zealand and Australia, and that we would cooperate heavily in the Atlantic, and we would provide some limited support for British activity in the Mediterranean or around the British Isles, but we were not capable of doing much of that. So we had already, in a sense, carved up the globe in anticipation of what was going on. Singapore was basically doomed if the Japanese wanted to take it. The British Navy could not stop the Japanese Navy. They had insufficient resources, given what they were dealing with in 1940-41, right? You remember France is surrendered. The Germans control the coast. And they are launching an amazing submarine warfare against Britain, plus trying to pound it into submission with aircraft. So the British Navy cannot afford to send many resources around to Singapore, halfway around the world, when they're afraid that the Germans are going to invade them. They need the British Navy to prevent that. So Singapore is basically gone when you really look at it critically. Similarly, the Dutch had no resources worth much. They had some naval ships out there, and we'll discuss them a little bit as we go along. But ultimately, those places were going to be lost if the Japanese wanted to commit the resources to take them. Our biggest failure was we didn't know how long it would take. We thought we could hold out much longer. And on top of that, we made a number of tactical and strategic decisions, which basically weakened us even further. So this is just a very quick review of some of the things that went on when certain agreements were reached between the Americans, British, and the Canadians. That's what the C is there. And one of the most important and far-reaching was the development of the Combined Chiefs of Staff, which you see me listing up here. But we also set out what the strategic goals were to be. And one that was of certainly the greatest importance was to defeat Germany first. Why? Because the national interests and security of the United States relied much more on defeating Germany than it did on defeating Japan. If you look at it again in a very stark contrast, even looking at it today, you could ask yourself, can the United States as a modern economy exist without access to the Far East? Or do our strategic interests lie much more critically in Europe and in the West? Because ultimately, that is the kind of question that Roosevelt's administration faced. Now, the way they answered it was, we depend more on Europe than we do on the Far East. Now, is that true today? Each of us can decide for ourselves how we think that balances out. But remember also that back then, the United States was the #1 producer of oil. So we had plenty of fuel to run our economy. We lacked certain resources like rubber, but there were synthetics that one could put together. And trade, our balance of trade was primarily towards Europe, not towards China and Japan. So in terms of our robust economy, the shift was much clearer towards Europe. And the threat that Germany posed was much clearer and more serious than it was in the Pacific. So keep these things in mind as we think about what's going on today. Now, one of the key elements was that soon after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese had already planned and were executing, had actually started days before Pearl Harbor, of moving their military equipment to places from which they would launch their various invasions. And they launched a number of them nearly simultaneously. Now, one of the most critical ones from the standpoint of the United States was the Philippines. Why? Because that was an American territory, if you will. Even though we were going to give the Philippines independence, and I think it was 46 or 47, we were still very much in charge. And General MacArthur was there as a, I'll call it a Philippine general, partly to coordinate the activities of both the Philippine military services and American military services. A failure on MacArthur's part, which has never been explained adequately in anything I've come across, is that after Pearl Harbor, MacArthur did not launch the heavy bombers he had at Clark Field to attack Hainan and Taiwan, which were within range. And indeed, on that particular time frame that went on, the Japanese planes in those islands were grounded due to bad weather. But for reasons which I have never found, never run across, MacArthur did not launch an attack. And instead, the following day, the Japanese came and basically eliminated the heavy bombers at Clark Field before they were able to do anything. And therefore quickly established air superiority over the Philippines. So even though American aircraft still existed from various airfields and tried to intervene, the Japanese were basically in control. And they executed several landings, one of which was in an island up here, which had very little impact on anything, and another one here. But they landed in two prominent areas on the north coast of the Philippines, and in particular, began to drive south towards the Manila, the capital. And you see here just where some of the landings took place. Now, here's Bataan down here. Here's Manila Bay, there's Manila, and Corregidor is an island in the middle there, which isn't showing up on this particular map. What is remarkable is that the Japanese had amphibious landings. They drove off any of the garrisons that were in the immediate vicinities. They quickly consolidated and built up and supplied a large force, and they drove south, driving the Americans and the Filipinos back without suffering a great deal of casualties among themselves. And as they drove further south, the plans which MacArthur had initially thought to use, which was to defend at the beaches, was quickly undone. And as a result, felt that the only place where the Americans and Philippines could form any level of resistance was on the peninsula of Bataan, because of the limitation of access. This would allow a relatively smaller force to resist a larger force because they can't bring as much power to bear as they might otherwise. And as a consequence of that, he declared Manila an open city. Now, interestingly, if you look at the concepts of urban warfare and what it means if you're fighting in a city, and all you have to do is to look at the current conflict between Ukraine and Russia and get into some of the weeds on the fighting in towns that's going on. You realize that towns are really labor intensive. They consume people and supplies at an astonishing rate. But instead of defending in Manila, because he didn't want to see the civilian population beaten up, which is a natural consequence, or see the city destroyed, which is another natural consequence. Instead, he felt that he would declare it an open city and turn it over to the Japanese, while he took his troops, such as he could get, over to Bataan. Now, what's the value of holding Bataan other than that the Japanese can't get at you? Well, if you have sufficient firepower, you can close Manila Bay to transports. And that's fine, except the Japanese didn't need it at this point. They were landing their troops and supplies elsewhere and bringing them down to support their armed forces. And they were going to launch another attack further south, which you see here, which would also permit them to come up from the south and trap any forces. So why hold on? Evacuation was not possible once you've lost air control. The Japanese would be able to pretty much sink any transports that are trying to get out of there. Fast vessels such as PT boats, which were used to evacuate MacArthur, for example, or submarines, might get you out. But big stuff, targets, not going to work once you've lost air control. So what is the other purpose of hanging on to the Philippines? It was initially intended to buy time for the US Pacific Fleet to gear up and come and rescue them. But interestingly, as we approached the war, before the war actually broke out, the American High Command realized that the Philippines were basically lost. So now you come to another important decision. If you're going to lose it, why do you leave thousands of Americans there, as an example? Why sacrifice them? Political expediency? So you can tell the American people, look what the Japanese have done. You know, they've killed a lot of Americans in the Philippines. And your other question is, if that's my son or daughter who's over there, what was the point of that? So these kinds of questions resonate through this discussion, but they're ones which we should continue to remind ourselves exist with us right today. And I hope that none of us had any direct losses in Afghanistan or Iraq or Syria or other places where our military is engaged at some level of conflict. But anytime this happens, one cannot help but ask, what was the value of that? Of having that, my son or my daughter killed or severely wounded or whatever, when it was already known that this wasn't going to turn out well. All right. Okay, I know that's enough proselytizing for my positions. The Bataan Peninsula and Corregidor held out for a remarkably long period of time. Interestingly, it wasn't until actually very early May that the final surrender took place. So if you think it's 6 months, these guys held out, but they had nowhere to go. And ultimately, when you're forced into a corner, you're going to fight. So it didn't matter anymore politically. You weren't getting out. And you certainly aren't going to surrender quickly. You're going to fight. And indeed, the fighting for Bataan cost the Japanese a fair amount. The Japanese did not need an excuse to punish the local population, right? As I talked about in one of my previous lectures, the way they behaved in China, the way they behaved in any occupied country was basically racism. The Japanese considered themselves superior to everyone else and therefore could do what they wished with any of them, and they did. On top of the difficulty that occurred in the fighting of Bataan, there were also guerrilla actions that took place from Americans and Philippine soldiers and even just locals who did not like the idea that the Japanese were coming to occupy their region, so they took action. But when that happens, as tends to occur in any situation like this, it's the local population that takes the brunt of the damage. So yes, you can go blow up a truck, or you can derail a train maybe, or you can shoot a couple of soldiers on patrol, but then they're going to come back and they're going to kill everybody in a village. And this is the kind of action that takes place constantly in the Philippines, as well as elsewhere. Now, as I had mentioned before, there had been a different definition of various areas of responsibility. And when this happened, the agreement among the Americans, British, Dutch, and Australians was an attempt to coordinate activities to try to resist what the Japanese were doing. The Japanese knew what they were doing. They had planned for it. They had worked on the training and doctrine necessary to carry it out. They were still flexible in their thinking and actions. But when you have 4 different countries involved in trying to decide what's going to happen, it just doesn't work as well. And the ABDA collapsed for a whole lot of different reasons, not just because of the Japanese activities. But the consequences were enormous, because in that area that you see outlined, other than what is present here in Northern Australia, basically all of that fell to the Japanese. And it fell within a remarkably short period of time. And again, the distances involved here are enormous, as I showed on one of the previous slides. Now, this is just a more detailed view of what was happening to British Malaya here, Kota Bharu and Kuala Lumpur and so on. And the Japanese landed. Yamashita was in charge of all of this. And they quickly drove the British, Indian troops, Australian troops primarily. Actually, there were a lot of British there, but there were a lot of Commonwealth soldiers there, back towards Singapore, which was thought to be a real fortress. Historians will say that the reason Singapore fell quickly was because the major guns were focused out to sea. That's true, that the biggest guns were focused out to sea, because if you want to sink a ship, you need, a 10, 12-inch, 14-inch gun. If you're shooting against infantry, those weapons aren't really all that helpful. Okay. What you need are somewhat smaller, more flexible artillery to do that. And they had plenty of that. But in the course of their retreats down the Malay Peninsula, they were losing a lot of equipment and the morale was falling rapidly. Anytime they would set up a roadblock somewhere, the Japanese would get around it and attack them from the rear and capture or drive off a bunch of people and so on. So even at the point at which the Japanese are attacking down, and if you just compare total numbers, the Japanese are outnumbered. When they get down to Singapore, they cross over. Again, it's almost an amphibious landing. They cross over on bridges and things that they're able to find. And within a relatively short period of time, they defeat the garrison there. And something like 50,000 soldiers end up surrendering. Now, again, I've talked about the Eastern Front in the previous lectures, where we had a couple of Kessels, the Germans call them cauldrons, where over 600,000 Russians are captured. But here you say, well, 50,000, but that's basically everybody that's there. You can't do anything to re-support them or whatever. So these are gone, gone, gone. And on top of it, you'll see down here, First Air Fleet. After the Japanese come back from Pearl Harbor, way over here, and they go up to Japan and they refit and they get pretty ready, within a relatively short period of time, they penetrate into the Indian Ocean. They attack the primary British bases at Trincomalee and Colombo. They intercept much of the merchant traffic that is passing along here, and they sink over 800,000 tons of shipping in a period of several months. So they have been devastating this whole area, even though from the land occupation, they initially held this part. Now they took Rangoon fairly quickly. It took them several months to get up to Mandalay, which is up here. And in time, they penetrated right up to the border of India, but that's something that comes later. The point is that the Japanese were showing themselves to be masters at warfare. They were far and away ahead of pretty much everybody. Similarly, this is just a more detailed view of how they traveled down the Malay Peninsula. North is in this direction, going off here. And in this regard, they very quickly had to deal with very difficult terrain, much of which was impassable. So they tended to pass along the coastline. But what I want to point out, and the reason this slide is helpful, is look at these maneuvers. For those of you who are well-versed in history, if you look at the fighting in Sicily, in 43, the Americans kept trying to get these little amphibious landings around behind the Germans who were defending. Or if you look at island hopping, this is in effect a sort of island hopping. They're using what assets they have in a very capable way. Trained properly, good doctrine, good supply, you can do this. And you can outmaneuver your enemy repeatedly. And it's really an amazing experience. This is just a blow up of something else that just shows you a degree of how the Japanese were able to challenge and drive back. This symbol here, these 4 X's, is an army. The 3 spikes that you see here is a regiment. The 2 X's represent a division. The reason this is important is not because the numbers necessarily correlate together, but you've got a division, you've got another division here, you've got brigades, which together make up a division, you've got another division. It looks as though the Japanese are outnumbered, and they were, but they fought more effectively. Similarly, this is just a good slide that just shows what happened around Singapore, and access across into the main fortress of the Singapore was very, very limited, yet the Japanese did it. So if you're the British and you know the Japanese are coming down the Malay Peninsula, that there's no indication they're going to invade you by sea, where you've got all those nice big guns that you can use to show up, blow up transports. What are you going to do to try to keep them from crossing from here into your territory? Well, you're going to muster your defenses on that side, right? So it seems as though it should be pretty easy to keep the Japanese from getting across. Well, didn't work out that way. What about elsewhere? Again, I talked in terms of the slide about the enormous complexity of operations that take place. Think of what the planning was to do this, to have all these different forces come down and take all of these critical points along the various coastlines, all of the points that were critical to you controlling the interior. And if the defenders retreated into the interior, who cared? They were basically non-entities at that point, no supplies, no support. They were going to die on the vine. Again, this shows not just the enormous capacity the Japanese demonstrated to bring forward these attacks within a short period of time, their willingness to take risk, which is another element, the careful intelligence that's required to let you know if the force structure you're going to bring up against your defender is sufficient to take and hold what you're getting. And does it meet your strategic goals? Yes.
What was the situation of British air power there? With enough air power, you can hold them off.
You can, but the British unfortunately had limited air power both at Singapore and later even at Trincomalee and at Chaddur, which is on the far east edge of India. They did have aircraft at Rangoon initially, and because of the Japanese superiorities, they were driven back with losses to Mandalay, and then from there had very little they could bring in. They finally brought in some Hurricanes, but the Hurricane had very limited range. So in terms of action, it was only usable for defense. It really wasn't usable to intercept and defeat at a distance, which the Japanese were capable of doing from very long distances. The other part was that the Dutch had a lot of outmoded aircraft, and those had some capacity and did some damage. 2 particular types. One was the Martin, trying to remember what some of the others were, it's escaping me right now. But by and large, they had a mishmash of aircraft and they had poor infrastructure support. So spare parts, things of that nature were lacking. And because once you lost a pilot, there was no way to get more pilots in. They were also beginning to attrit down to practically nothing over time. The few long-range bombers that were available didn't come in until somewhat later in the war and landed. I think we landed some B-17Es at Darwin. But others were either destroyed on the ground, such as it happened in the Philippines, or the few that escaped, again, no infrastructure to support them. Yeah, you could put weapons on them, but once you lost the plane, you didn't have a replacement. So it became very difficult from that standpoint. And the Japanese, remember, by having the initiative, could choose the point of attack. So if you have to respond, but I'm attacking where Judy is, your aircraft will only reach as far as your wife. You got nothing to do over there. I'm ahead of you. That's air supremacy. But if I can control you as well as this, that's air superiority. And the Japanese quickly established that. Interestingly, when you look at this particular fighting that occurred through the Malay area, Japanese carriers were not involved there very much. They might have had a light carrier or two down there to support operations, but most of it was land-based. And they just kept incrementally destroying what was in front of them, take a new air base, fly in aircraft, bring in the stuff they needed, and from relatively primitive airstrips, put up fighters which could take out your opponent.
Wow.
Yes.
As the Dutch retreated, did they destroy the oil infrastructure?
They did, and they did a fairly good job of it. The Japanese actually expected that to happen, and they arranged for engineers and repair crews to come along with their transports. The destruction in a lot of areas, particularly a place like Palembang, which was one of the largest oil fields on Sumatra, was destroyed effectively enough that it took months before they could get anything out of it. The biggest failure that the Japanese faced later in the war had to do with the loss of their tankers. Because as the Americans began to get smart, they took out tankers, which meant that even if you're producing oil in Sumatra or Java, you can't get it anywhere. And indeed, at the end of the war, much of the Japanese fleet was actually based in Singapore, not in Japan, because that's where the oil was. Let's take a break. And I'm sorry to keep going on like that, but I'll take questions from anyone, and we will continue on with this discussion in about another 5 or so minutes. Is that all right?
Yep.
Yeah,
Okay.
thank you.
Anyone out there in Zoom land have a question?
Nothing in the chat.
No,
So it's either you've all fallen asleep, or I've covered the topic so beautifully that there's nothing to ask.
Was there enough Dutch oil to make up for what Japan could no longer get from the United States?
Yes, there's an interesting, I'll literally call it a game. And it's a computer-based game. It's somewhat old. And what it shows in the game, in this particular region, is the amount of fuel that is in various locations like Batavia, Surabaya, Palembang, Darwin, Trincomalee, and so on. And part of what the game requires of you as a player is to shift and move resources in order to keep your forces supplied and functioning. The amount of oil that was in storage at Batavia and Surabaya and Palembang was really enormous. Because again, there had been limited shipping back to the east, and when war broke out in Europe, and the interdiction that the Germans were attempting, The British were hoping that the oil fields in the Middle East would be more supportive of what they needed, but the Dutch were still producing. But then they couldn't transport. So what do? You got to just hold on to it. So there were great resources and the Japanese were counting on that. Now, an interesting spin-off to the game is that if you're playing the Dutch, British forces, you send transports out, you grab all of the fuel you can, and you bring it back to Trincomalee or to Darwin so that the Japanese won't have it. Just an aside, but it makes it fun. And it shows you some of the challenges that were faced by both sides. And it teaches you a little bit more about how complex this whole thing can get very quickly.
I'm finding this fascinating because I spent all the war, and I surely remember the war in Chennai, Madras.
Really?
And this was breakfast table conversations for us. And my cousin fought the Japanese down the Burma Peninsula to Mandalay. One of the things that was interesting was they had really intended to take India, because my governess who left, I was homeschooled until I was 8, and then she left she joined the Women's Royal Army Corps, and she was sent up to Burma.
Oh.
And she sent me when they captured Japanese. The Japanese had each been given a pile of money that was printed specifically for being spent in India as a new Indian currency to replace the rupee.
Right.
And I used to have that.
Oh.
I lost it, damn it.
Well, there's another interesting side to that, and that is that an Indian leader named Bose had recruited Indians to join the Japanese
Yes.
with the idea that eventually they would drive out the British colonists. And even Mahatma Gandhi was said to have wanted the Japanese to win. Now, the consequences of that would have been pretty tragic for the Indian nation, but I won't go there. Yes.
Yes,
It is.
a question from Dory Allman. The Japanese looked upon foreigners as foreign devils. Germans thought Aryans were superior. Did these ideologies cause any type of conflict between the generals/leaders of these different countries, or did the different geographic focuses of Germany and Japan diffuse any tensions?
That's an excellent question. And it leads us to a speculation, but to answer your question more directly, I think at the time, the impact of the racial tensions that would have existed had Japan and Germany been looking at the same resource, never came into play. Ultimately, if Germany had won and Japan had won, you could speculate that they would see each other as serious enemies ideologically, but then it becomes down to a practicality. How much of the world can you control depending on which nation you are? Could Germany control the entire world? No. Could Japan? No. So the idea was that the racial effects were much more dramatic and local than they were at the highest diplomatic levels. That doesn't mean that there wasn't an understanding or interpretation or a view of the political levels, such as existed, for example, when Germany was cooperating with Russia over the division of Poland. Hitler and his group had viewed the Russians and the Slavs as inferior. But the expediency of protecting the eastern side of Germany from attack from Russia and dividing up Poland was something they would agree to. But because of the racial tension, in good measure, along with the goals that Hitler had outlined in taking land from the east, was such that this conflict was going to become much more brutal than would occur when the Germans are fighting the Americans and even the French and the British. Similarly, it's easy to imagine that the way the Japanese treated indigenous populations was nothing more than a reflection of how they would have treated anyone if they were dominant. There would be the elites, and then there would be everybody else. And that's a kind of effect that I think you're reaching towards in this description. Any other questions? Okay. When we use the word the octopus effect, I know it kind of gets everybody a little bit bothered. It sounds demonic and dangerous, but the important part of something like this slide, just as an example, is to show that when you concentrate particular actions here and then you send out these various groups to attack all these disparate areas, this is a requirement of coordination and thinking and planning that is truly extraordinary. And you can't do this on the fly, especially when your resources have to come from several thousand miles over the sea. Even getting down into the details that some of us who've studied military history for a long time understand, is even how you load a transport can have a great influence on what happens once you land a fighting force on a beach. If your transport isn't loaded with what's called combat loaded, where the most essential elements come off the ship first and are delivered properly to the front line, then you can have supplies piling up all over the place, but they're useless because they're put in the wrong sequence. For example, if you're going to land a vehicle, you don't want to land the gasoline first, right? I mean, so that's what we're talking about here. But it takes planning, and every single ship has to be set up in that particular way. And if you're going to put together 15 or 20 transports with the appropriate escorts and the appropriate training of troops that are going to be conducted and how you're going to get them on the shore and all the rest of it, just goes to the heart of how complicated all of this is. Okay. Now, wrong way. This just shows the second technical effect. And the idea here is that the concentration of effort over a relatively short period of time was truly extraordinary. But these particular initiatives all had the strategic goal that was outlined at the very beginning. That is, Japan had to control the resources which were vital to her economy and to her conduct of the war. And she had to have what she considered a nearly impenetrable barrier with which to resist the oncoming attacks that were expected from the United States and from Britain. The British were less a threat. The Japanese already knew what was going on in Europe. They were well aware of the concentrated effort that had to be put forth by the British government to protect the British Isles, keep it secure. So they knew there wouldn't be a lot of stuff coming their way from the West. They did know it was going to come from the East. And they made further steps that were going to have a great influence on what happened later on. We're not going to get to that in this particular lecture. So you have to show up for my spring lectures if you want to follow with the rest of the story.
Oh, geez.
Listen, I got to have more people coming. You know, it's just part of what gives me my lift up. But this gives you a hint as to the second phase that we will talk about in more detail. The idea now is that even by June and then August of 42, here down in May, they've gotten as far down here. Basically, the Japanese have set out a perimeter, which is what their initial goal was. Now, they plan to move it a little bit further, and that's part of what got them into trouble, but we'll talk about that another time. Similarly, they had pressed up and driven the British out to the borders of India. The Japanese stopped there. They still had that Indian army under Bose that I mentioned that wanted to take India for the Indians, so to speak. But logistically, militarily, the Japanese didn't have the force to do that. It would require a complete collapse on the part of the United States for the Japanese to be able to move the resources they needed in order to conquer India. And despite the internal turmoil, many of those in India were still supportive of the British Commonwealth. And in fact, as I showed you in the slide on the Malay Peninsula, many Indian units were there. So it wasn't as though the British lacked any support. There was still a great deal of tension, but it was hardly over for them. This just goes to show again, as I mentioned something a little earlier, that when the British did try to launch an offensive, and they had to wait almost a year from the onset of the war that you'll see here in December to try to drive the Japanese back, they just weren't able to do it. And the fighting in Burma, which I'm not going to spend time on, is well worth reading about, because the terrain and the circumstances under which they fought, the kind of training and adjustments that had to be made were amazing. And while I was talking last time about how bitter the cold was in Russia and so on, at this particular time in these particular regions, this was some of the most miserable weather you could imagine, with all the indigenous diseases that go along with it. And we sometimes also forget how difficult the terrain is. We tend to look at, well, you know, the Himalayas are this high and the Alps are that high and how impenetrable they are. We forget that it isn't so much a matter of height as it is the slope that really determines a great deal of whether or not you can traverse it. So if you're trying to go up a slope of 45 degrees, good luck to you, all right? That's tough going, even with hands and feet helping you get up, much less bring vehicles up. And this picture just kind of demonstrates part of that difficulty. And look at the construction that it would take to build that road going up so you could get over to And this again is another part of what plays an enormous role that is often underappreciated in dealing with any conflict. And that is all of the support, which I emphasize repeatedly, logistical support, but even construction. So if you're going to build a road and you're going to cut it through a forest, just for a moment, just ask yourself, what do I need? Well, I need saws. I got to cut down trees. Some of these trees are enormous. All right, so I've cut the tree down, now what? Well, I've got to carve it up. Well, how do I carve it up? How do I move it to where I can carve it? And then I have to grade the road. Well, suppose it's swampy and wet. Well, how do I fix that? So there'll be a road here. Do I build a causeway? You know, how do I build it? Where do I get the materials to build it? Who builds it? How many people are committed to it? I have to feed them and house them and clothe them and all the rest of it. So much of what is going on at the senior levels of command are not just drawing an arrow on a map and say, go from here to there and go beat the enemy up. It's how do you get there? What support do you need to get there? And again, the Japanese proves themselves amazingly adept at doing this. But over time, because of the limitations on their numbers and their economy, it all began to unravel the longer the war went on. And that's something the Japanese knew. That's why they talked about a perimeter, not of invading the United States. Now, just as another example here is that the Japanese began relatively early. Now, this says Solomon's New Guinea of January of 43. So this is after a year. But what I want to emphasize is not this. We're going to talk about this at length in another set of lectures. But that within a relatively short period of time, they were already beginning to speculate that coming down here, and taking this area might be helpful to strengthening that perimeter. Now, this set in motion a whole lot of different events that had a critical importance to what's going to happen in the following year, after the first 6 months.
Could you
Yes.
go back and point out where Rabaul is?
Yeah. Right here.
Okay, so it's a
On
fair
New Britain.
distance away from Guadalcanal.
Yes, and you'll see this legend, 200 miles. Now, this is important because if you consider that that's about almost 700 plus miles when you get down to Guadalcanal. But Japanese aircraft that fought over Guadalcanal often started here. Now, some came from Bougainville, some came from Buca. Up here in Shortlands is another place, though Shortlands was primarily a seaplane base. Down here, you have to fly all that distance. You have to combat whatever aircraft you encounter, and then you have to be able to fly home. The Americans couldn't do that. The Japanese could. Again, an interesting technological change that goes on. It wasn't until much later in the war that the Americans were capable of having aircraft here, which could actually reach even up there, other than our long-range bombers. Okay, all right. Any questions about this particular point? Because I'm going to move on to the Battle of the Atlantic, and I probably
Yes, I do have a question.
yes.
And the earlier slide, you said one of the listing to the side was that Gandhi relied on Japan. Did I get that correct?
Not relied on Japan. He was in favor of the British being thrown out of India, and actually had written some information about supporting, that is, literally, and I mean that in terms of literal writing.
Okay,
The Japanese driving out the British.
okay.
And
Because that was in the height of the battle of trying to get independence from Great Britain. So
Yes.
here he saw an opportunity and says, well, I could curry favor at one end to get rid of the other guy. Okay, gotcha.
exactly, sort of like the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
My friend, yeah, okay,
Now, the
gotcha.
problem
Thanks.
here was that if he'd been successful, if the Japanese had been successful, India would be a very different place from the way it is today.
Yeah, thanks.
That's my prejudice. One of the things that I've talked about on a number of occasions has to do with how one prepares a nation for a conflict. And this is an important element because in a representative republic such as we have in the United States, there's a great interaction between the general population and our representatives. At least they're supposed to be. And we at least handle that through voting, through letters, through protests. Whatever it is, we feel will gain the attention of our representatives and have them listen to us. Unlike other situations, such as was occurring in Soviet Russia, or even occurring in Japan, or occurring in Nazi Germany or fascist Italy, the disconnect between the population and the elite, the rulers, was not absolute. They still had to, understand what was going on in the general population, but generally their planning and their initiatives could be taken without a great deal of worry over what the general population was doing. Now, we'll make those decisions for you. And that's an ethos that you build over time. One way you build the ethos is by having in place, as the Japanese did, certain philosophic principles which you gradually disseminate among the people in general. You create victims and villains, you create a certain moral superiority, and you define certain things within terms that you believe represent what I tend to call an ideological truth. So any deviation from the truth by its very nature becomes perverse. Or if you want to put it in religious terms, you might even call it evil, and therefore worthy of destruction. In each of those particular countries that I've referenced, maybe less so in Italy than elsewhere, opposition was absolutely crushed. And it was crushed rather mercilessly. Once the government had the power and could control the reins of power sufficiently, it became rather easy by comparison to a kind of country that we have or Britain had and so on, to destroy the opposition to the point of being not quite inert, but certainly of no major consequence to any decisions that were going to be made. That was not true for us getting into this war. And as I did work getting ready for these lectures, some of my bias against certain things Roosevelt did were moderated by the perceptiveness and his particular political insights that allowed him to do certain things, but always keep in mind what the American people were thinking and looking for him to accomplish. And I have to say that it really, not quite a revelation, but I could remove bias by trying to pay more attention to what's going on. When nations no longer have to pay attention to the people become nothing more than levers to be manipulated and pushed into certain actions. Roosevelt knew he couldn't do that, despite the problems with the Depression, profound as those were. And it's hard for us who never lived through it to really understand it, but I'm sure some of you had parents who lived through it and maybe even talked about it as to how awful a time that was. Roosevelt still took actions to try to protect the country from what he believed was coming. He did some of this in secret, but a lot of it he had to do through Congress. He respected the Constitution enough that he needed to go to Congress to get approval for things that were going to happen. He didn't have executive power to just say, you're going to do this, even though he was commander-in-chief, because that's one of the peculiarities of our Constitution. He worked with Congress to develop these naval expansions that I mentioned. And there's a fellow named Carl Vinson, who was a Democrat out of Georgia in the House, who helped get a lot of this stuff through. And in fact, because of Vinson's own particular importance in building the Navy, we had the Carl Vinson aircraft carrier named for him. That's how important a person he was. And in terms of that, we began to expand markedly our naval building capacity. Now that meant not just building more ships. It meant also you have to build the shipyards. You have to begin to allocate resources from your budget, because this is a federal budget. At a time of crisis with depression, you have to be able to convince the American people this is important. We're diverting resources to building up our Navy. So this is important. What about the neutrality patrol? When war broke out in Europe, it was pretty clear to at least Roosevelt and many in his administration, and for both political parties, to recognize the danger Germany posed. Now, not everybody agreed with that. And you can go back and find very prominent people saying, that's not our fight, stay out of it, we're not going to do any of this nonsense. Let those Europeans kill each other for all we care. You know, they're a bunch of idiots anyway, and they just got done 20 years ago doing the same damn thing. But he said, we're going to set up certain patrol lines, and they drew them literally on a map in order to say that we will identify any belligerent crossing into this area And we will alert the rest of the world, so to speak, to their presence. Well, this meant for Germany a real slap in the face. Because we got Canada to the north as part of the British Commonwealth, right? And we have the Monroe Doctrine going back into the early 1800s of saying we're not going to allow certain encroachments to occur. What else did we do? Britain needed destroyers, escorts for convoys, and they needed it for anti-submarine warfare. So what did we do? We said, well, we'll give you the destroyers, but in return, we want leases to bases which will protect our perimeter. This is 1940. We're not in the war, right? But he's saying, we better start thinking about protecting ourselves. Now, 50 destroyers. Well, most of them were World War I vintage or soon after World War I vintage. They're called four stackers. And they were important for the British to have, but they had to also provide their own crews. And we, in the meantime, had land bases now, which we could use to help protect our perimeter. What about the Havana Conference? The Havana Conference was an interesting conference that took place after the fall of France. Now, France had islands in the Caribbean. Vichy France was existing, but basically a puppet of Germany. What the Havana Conference said is that any non-American nation having territory in the Western Hemisphere cannot turn that territory over to another non-American nation. So if, for example, Martinique was to be turned over to Germany because they wanted to put a base there and then they wanted to base submarines there, basically we were saying, you're not going to get to do that. We decided you're going to have to stay on your side of the Atlantic Ocean. That's an extraordinary feat of diplomacy when you think about it, because it basically slapped Germany in the face, right? Because the British weren't going to turn over British islands to Germany, right? But the French might have, just as they were holding their navy close to France, both in North Africa and Toulon in the southern part of France, for example, rather than send them to the Caribbean where they could have been based and used or interned. What about the US-Canada Mutual Defense Pact? Another example of saying, nobody better threaten Canada. Remember what Churchill said if Britain was overrun? We're going to Canada. So this basically says you're Germany, even if you take England, safe harbor for the British government in Canada, and we will be protecting them too. Yes.
In the destroyers for bases, I'm trying to figure out where the bases we traded for were.
I'm trying to remember. Bermuda was one, I believe. We had a couple in the Caribbean. I don't know if the Grand Bahamas were part of it. I could probably look that up, but it was basically whatever was along the east coast.
In the Western Hemisphere.
Yes, all Western Hemisphere.
Exclusive. Okay.
Yes.
That's fine. Thank you.
Now, selective service training. Yes.
And before the Havana Conference, when Churchill ordered the destruction of the French fleet, that was before the Havana Conference or after?
I don't remember the exact dates. My best recollection, it was before.
Okay, and that's not so that the Germans wouldn't get a hold of the hardware, so to speak.
Correct, but
Yeah.
it was all very close together. So you've made an excellent point. I just don't have it in the front of my brain where not much exists anymore. The filing cabinets are increasingly empty.
We all are.
The Selective Service and Training Act was another thing, which was an enormous effort to convince the American people that allegedly in time of peace, we're going to register all military age people, and we're going to have that available for actual conscription. So the idea wasn't that we were necessarily starting immediately to build up the armed forces, but we were putting in place the necessaries, the legalities, which would permit us to do that as quickly as possible. Now, Lend-Lease you have here, sorry. Just to summarize very quickly, the analogy that was used at the time to explain this was the following. Your neighbor's house is burning down. You give them a hose to use. What do you ask in return? Return the hose when you're done. Or if for some reason the hose is damaged or destroyed, replace it. That's all. You're not asking to be paid up front. Now that has an enormous implication for Britain because their financial resources are diminishing rapidly as they are geared up and responding to the threats posed by Germany. So this is a big financial windfall. It delays all payments until much later when you can kind of add up what was destroyed and say, okay, you got to pay us for that after the war is done, after the house is under control. Again, politically, this was an extraordinary thing to do. And it required the cooperation of both parties. That meant both parties had to recognize its importance in securing the United States. This was in part, of course, to help Britain survive, because we knew the survival of Britain would be an important element in our own security. But this was not a matter of trading British lives for American lives. That's a different issue here. And it doesn't come until somewhat later that one might make that argument. But, and then the final thing was that at very high levels, you have staff conversations taking place. So military leaders from Britain are coming to the United States and sitting down with our chief military leaders, figuring out how the war is going to be run once we're in it. The military takes a more positive, direct approach than does the political. The political can say, if we get in the war. The military says, when. They don't necessarily set a particular date, but they say, we are going to plan as though we are going to be in this war. And we need to define areas of responsibility, targets, all the rest of it. And that's a level of secrecy that has to be put in place as well. You can't have that out resonating with the American people. We're going to get very, very upset because you'll look at it and say, well, you know, you're just pulling us into war. Yes.
There were multiple slaps at Germany outlined in the previous slide.
Yes.
We had a stream of German immigrants, a significant stream. How were the politics finessed that the German immigrants did not take umbrage at this?
Well, it's an interesting question. And in part, it was due to what I'll call a non-racial bias, because the other side of this coin is how we treated the Japanese. Remember, there were over 100,000 Japanese citizens in Hawaii, and there were at least an equal number, if not double that number, on the West Coast. In part, those who came as immigrants had recognized two elements about Germany. And again, I'm making a blanket statement. Believe me, it's obviously subject to nuance. They came to the United States because of what the United States offered, as has been true of immigrants through time immemorial coming to the United States. Opportunity and freedom. The ability to engage with your political representatives, have a voice, to have your property secured under law, not subject to arbitrary challenge. We know how untrue that can be at times, but I'm just saying in general. And as a result, for decades, even before this happened, Germans had been coming to the United States. If you look back into the mid 1800s, after the conflicts that took place through Europe, through various rebellions, a great many German immigrants. I'm not talking about the Irish and the potato famine, all right? We're talking about political events on the continent of Europe. Thousands, hundreds of thousands of Germans came to the United States. So there was a large, I'll call it indigenous population of Germans. There was a large German-based culture, but it also meant there was a welcoming effect because you not only had connections ethnically through your German heritage, but you had an assumption of certain values that were bringing you here. So it was less of a challenge than it might have been. And unfortunately, we, as at the time, and the government offered all kinds of rationalizations for it, which were accepted by most of us at the time, that somehow the Japanese who were living here were not as reliable, that they would be a fifth column and would undermine or help work to support the Japanese government in their conflict with us. And just as an aside, some of you may know that one of the most decorated units in the American Army was a Japanese unit that fought primarily in Italy. We didn't want them fighting against their own people, so to speak, but we had no problem sending Germans to the Western Front to fight Germans. Again, a reflection of how we all can view things through a somewhat different lens. Now, December 41, all right, December 7, 41. Think back for a moment, what was happening on the Eastern Front? Germany, for the last 2 days, starting December 5th, was under an offensive by the Russians. And we talked at some length in our last lectures about how the Russians were forcing the Germans back under appalling conditions and the situations that were arising at the time. Moscow had at the time felt it was nearly defeated, but they had managed to push back. Notice that the first Moscow conference takes place in September and October, just as Operation Typhoon on the part of the Germans is being launched as a final drive to Moscow, to take Moscow, to drive Russia out of the war. And we're already engaged in talking to them and trying to coordinate planning that's going on. So as we look through these various issues, we also realize down here the second Moscow conference that takes place in 42, all right? Now, what was happening then? We haven't talked about that, comes in the later lecture. That the Germans have launched another massive attack on Russia, but to the south, not with Moscow as the target. But again, Russia is reeling from losses. And again, they feel they're backed up against the wall with no place to go. This is extraordinarily dangerous for them. And yet, we're engaging with them. We're going down and saying, listen, we know you want a second front. We can't provide it. It's not possible. Think of what the Japanese finished doing in 6 months, right? With all the pre-war planning that was involved there. And we're saying the best we can do is invade North Africa, and that won't be for several months. So it's an example also of the kinds of discussions that were going on pre-engagement of the United States in the war. But once we become brought in the war, that becomes a more open secret, if you will. These conferences are known to the general public. And it's just a picture to just show that the combined chiefs of staff was one of the critical arrangements between the British and the Americans, and it lasted through the war, where the British had a permanent delegation here in the United States to conduct these kinds of conversations and conferences so we could work out planning. And some of the very bitter arguments that took place between the two sides is revealing reading. When we think about how we were able to accomplish what we did. Now, as we approach the end, I'm going to steer away from what I initially meant to be the topic of the battle for the Atlantic, because I don't want to shortchange it. There's a lot of information in there that I hope I can present next time. And then I can keep you all coming back for more. You know, it's like a cliffhanger approach. But I do want to say the following. By anyone's particular analysis, as we talk about the critical decisions that are made, and I've tried to emphasize what some of them were historically from the beginning of my lectures going way back. You know, why was this decision made? Why did this battle occur here? What were the elements that influenced the outcome? What were the implications of that going forward? I want to come to another particular important statement. I said earlier today that Yamamoto, in my view, at least in good measure, made an enormous strategic mistake by attacking Pearl Harbor without a formal declaration of war, and indeed defeated the very strategy that was critical to the Japanese maintaining their perimeter. Sinking the fleet in Pearl Harbor accomplished very little militarily, other than stall our ability to get those ships back up and running for a period of time. But it ultimately had no other real long-term effect. Whereas, if the American Navy with its carriers had been approaching the perimeter that the Japanese were establishing and been sunk out there, none of those vessels recoverable, that would have had a more dramatic effect, a more profound effect, not just on the military balance, because that's going to shift enormously in 42 and 43, as we'll learn, but more importantly, psychologically for the Americans. Those people who died at Pearl Harbor numbered around 3,000, correct? Somewhere in that framework. Imagine sinking the fleet in 7,000 feet of water. 3,000 would have seemed like a small number. Because you would have lost pilots, you would have lost all the crews, everything down at the bottom of the ocean. Now think of the turmoil that would cause politically. And you look at a situation, and I'm going to jump into this, though it may offend some people. The analogy with our withdrawal from Afghanistan, where we leave behind literally billions of dollars of equipment and so on, but at least we got our people out. Now imagine if all of that went down along with the people. What would be the reaction of any of us to our political and military leaders? See, utter incompetence. You need to be fired. In fact, in Russia, we'd take you out and shoot you, literally, because they did that. All right? Mm-hmm. They shot them. So we would be so offended, so angry with our own administration that the conspiracy theories that have been thrown around for the last 80 years regarding whether Roosevelt intended for the Japanese to attack Pearl Harbor or not would pale by comparison with what we would feel was the case. As it stood, the actions that lay at Kimmel and Short's feet show to me, again, my own particular judgment, a dereliction of duty, which was severe, but not profound, not where they need to be taken out and shot. Kind of thing. Because no one really expected Pearl Harbor to be attacked. Everybody thought it was going to be the Philippines and maybe Guam and maybe Wake, and we couldn't defend them anyway.
Well,
But they had enough warning to put themselves on a more secure footing where they would run air patrols. Just as an aside, if you look at the movie, I think it's Tora, they talk about wanting enough aircraft to do a 360 patrol around Hawaii. The Japanese aren't going to attack from the east, not likely to attack from the south. So you've got the west and the north. You don't need to cover 360. All right. And it doesn't mean you can't send out what you have. So you do the best you can with what you've got. Similarly, there were issues related to torpedo nets and other things. Well, when you mentioned about Toronto, did the Americans pay any attention to that? No. Oh, the British could sink Italian ships in Toronto Harbor, but those Japanese can't. Well, there's Rambo with the flamethrower, okay? Because you don't plan for what your enemy may be able to do. You plan for what you think he's going to do. That's when you get hammered. So these are a number of issues that play a role all the way through. And that as we reflect on the decisions that were made during the lead up to an engagement in the war and subsequently, we need to keep in mind that first, we're all human beings, we're fallible, we're going to make misjudgments, we're going to screw up for whatever reason. But at the same time, these decisions are going to cost lives. And that's not a trivial matter. The other question that I'm going to throw out to you is this. Well, two questions. What if Hitler did not declare war on the United States on December 11th? We've been attacked by Japan. We've declared war on Japan. We believe we're going to end up fighting the Germans at some point. But Hitler makes this huge mistake, among several others that he made, of declaring war on the United States because he felt we were already in it. But we weren't legally, and that constrained us. The second question is, what if the Japanese only attack the Philippines and maybe Wake and Guam? Then what? What would we do then? Well, we might still declare war on Japan, but you don't have that emotional oomph that we got from being attacked at Pearl Harbor. Would that change how we would think about what we were doing? The commitment we would make as a nation to fighting the Japanese. All right. Well, again, thank you for your patience, and I hope these lectures are interesting enough for you that you'll enjoy reading history.
Thank you, Dr. Bagdasarian.
I'll stick around
Thank
if
you.
you have any questions, but I thank you for the pleasure of doing this. To me, it's just amazing. And I get to talk.
Mike, I'm getting PTSD from these lectures, so I don't know whether I could take 4 more. I need a month of R&R.
I have a question.
Sure.
For you. If we could go back to the populace of Japan.
Sure.
The emperor was at that time considered almost like a god.
Yes, actually, he was considered to be descended from the gods.
Yeah. And what was how did the populace react to what was going on with the invasion of Hawaii? What do you think?
Well, there were a couple of different elements that answer that. One is, of course, the reverence with which the emperor was held was of profound significance. He was, from a practical standpoint, more of a, I use the word rubber stamp for the decisions made by the formal Japanese government. But he was an important one because that acknowledged for the general population that they had the seal of approval from the highest authority in the land. The second part was that the Japanese secret police were very active in suppressing outside or opposing views and made a concerted effort to shut down that opposition. That is separate from what many in the military did, which was actively assassinate opposing voices. So if you look through the history of Japanese ministers, those who were a little too outspoken against the military found themselves facing upward from 6 feet under.
And I'm assuming there was conscription.
Oh, absolutely. And it was seen as a religious obligation. So that the concepts that I alluded to last time and at the very beginning of this lecture, the way of the warrior, Banzai, is really what that emphasized, as well as other philosophic elements, meant that as an individual, and remember the structure of Japanese society prior to its modernization. So this had been inculcated in the general population for centuries, is that you as an ordinary person have little importance other than to obey your betters and to do what you're told or face severe punishment, which could be arbitrary execution in the times back of the samurai and the competing groups. It was a little less punishment oriented, but there was no question that the whip was known.
And the outside world was sort of veiled off.
Veiled off, but also demonized because of the encroachments and the things that the West and Russia had done to remove Japan from its prominence and its importance in the world. So again, it's a philosophic and emotional construct that's woven together very, very deeply in the soul of these people. Now, you want another example, just look at, say, the Taliban, all right, and the more strict arrangements, how does that play out? Well, the idea is that we own the truth, and you, with your so-called tolerance, are actually corrupted by Satan. And I'm not referring to the Grammys, okay? Forget what happened there. What you're dealing with is a moral construct where I have the truth. And when you oppose me, you are on the side of evil. And if you read my Substack writings, just as a throw out again, I've actually written about that just recently. Not because I'm trying to promote one side or the other, I'm trying to put things in context as to how societies control and regulate themselves. And when one group gains such authority and power to say it's our side as we define it, and there's no room for this other, then you're either in it or quite literally you're out. And that means anything can be done to you. The Germans instituted that with their legal laws called the Nuremberg laws by just removing citizenship from Jews. Said, we've decided it's legal to remove your citizenship, and because you're no longer a citizen, we can do anything we want to you. You're not getting the protections of the German Constitution.
Right.
Yes.
Did World War I lay the basis for World War II, this pre-planning was? That in the before actual war was, they seem to, be thinking ahead.
I think that there are two elements to that. You've raised an actual very interesting element. Germany in particular, even in the 20s, as early as 1923, I believe, was setting up arrangements with Soviet Russia to build its military. They established secret bases in Russia where they could practice armored tactics and build aircraft and use those aircraft as they felt would be appropriate for a coming conflict. There were a number of prominent people who felt that quite literally the armistice of November 11th, despite the treaties afterward that allegedly ended the war, was really just a hiatus until World War II would break out. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. I think that there were some leaders, particularly on the German side, who thought there's going to be another war and it's going to come relatively soon. Some of the German generals, even at the end of World War I, said as much. It's a little less clear that the French and the British anticipated it within the period of time that they were looking at. But remember, the French built the Maginot Line because they feared what was coming. And they built up their military forces as powerfully as they could because they feared what Germany would do as retribution. So it's an interesting argument, and one could say, as some people have, that World War really wasn't 1 and 2, it was just part 1, part 2. And it was the same war that was going to conduct right on through.
You needed time to reload.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And considering what happened globally, which we talked about in the lectures on the interwar years, it's rather striking that within 20 years, given all the chaos and economic problems, that by 1939, nations could go to war with this kind of commitment. As another side, just to point out something that I've been reading about recently in the conflict between Ukraine and Russia. And it's fascinating stuff to pair it up with what we're dealing with or what we've seen historically. Right now, due to the huge ammunition expenditures by both sides, particularly artillery, there's great deficiencies beginning to crop up. And there's great worry on the part, even of the United States, of replacing the stocks that we've been shipping over. In World War I, shortly after, it was by October of 1914, the combatant nations, Germany, France, Britain, were running out of shells. There's a long story, and I talked about a little bit about the shell shortage. The estimates of consumption of munitions was so far behind the actual fact that they literally were running out of shells. That's happening now in Ukraine and Russia, though Russia seems to be doing a better job of maintaining its munitions. But the United States is already recognizing, and there's some publications that talk about this, already recognizing that we do not have the manufacturing capacity to restore those munitions,
Have to get it from
maybe a couple of years. Now think about the profound effect that carries if you're China. Looking at it and saying, oh, they're running out of ammo.
Oh, boy.
Is there an opportunity? Yeah, just as another example, just something I remember from the lectures on the Eastern Front. One of the German artillery officers said, I fired more shells in 4 days on the Eastern Front than I did in 6 weeks fighting France. The idea behind it is a little bit like that Rambo effect. Okay, you look at it and you realize, did I plan poorly for this situation? And did I gear up? One of the things that is striking is how well Roosevelt seemed to anticipate what was going on. And I have to say, I hadn't given the guy, despite the readings I had done, as much credit as putting these lectures together have made me appreciate. Guy is just brilliant. And
That reinforces your point you made that the Japanese initial war was over much greater distances than at any time prior in history. World War I was fought, it was 500 miles.
yeah, largely, although the Eastern Front was big, but you're right, in terms of real global engagement
Right.
and the complexity of the operations the Japanese carried out, nothing in history came close to it. Nothing. It's just extraordinary.
I mean,
It really
I
is.
think even the German general staff had no experience working over thousands of miles.
Right, right, much less being able to cross the English Channel.
Uh-huh.
I think another thing about Roosevelt too that should be appreciated is how much of everything that happened, he was responsible for himself alone.
Yeah.
I read an interesting book called The Secret Wars, or The Secret War that Roosevelt was fighting. He was the only guy that knew
Yeah.
all the stuff that Wild Bill Donovan was doing and, what was happening here, what was happening over there. And we know this because when Truman came in, he didn't even know about the atomic
That's right.
bomb. I mean,
Exactly.
it's just incredible what Roosevelt internalized and maintained himself.
Yep.
It's phenomenal that anyone could do that.
And it shows how you don't trust your vice president.
Well, you don't trust anybody, actually, is really what it is. You don't trust anybody.
No, you
And
don't.
still could mess around with the Norwegian queen.
Oh, my goodness.
That was the way.
It was a good, yeah.
Oh, my. Well, again,
What did you?
thank you.
Makes me
folks.
feel-
Just fantastic. Oh, you got it.
Yeah, I've got two of these.
Yeah.